was assassinated in 1977, one of the first priests to be assassinated. In some of the books, you find him being referenced as the first priest. He was definitely one of the first priest who was leading attempts to organize communities, mostly poor communities who were living the injustices of the time. I think something that's interesting about Father Rutilio Grande is that he came full circle in terms of being born in El Paisnal from a humble family and then returning to El Paisnal. And that's where he actually was killed. He was on his way to El Paisnal when he was killed. But he returned, was born in El Paisnal, returned to serve his people in El Paisnal, and grew up witnessing the injustices of that area where he grew up, where he was born and he ministered, is an area where many farmers would come from faraway places to cultivate the land, and very few owners owned a vast majority of that area. So he was able to not only learn what was happening at a later stage in his life because he was sent to El Paisnal. That's where he was from, so he understood the conditions very well, knew the injustices, and knew not only what was creating the injustice, but who was creating the injustice. So he would sit around with parishioners or people that he would go and talk to, and would simply ask them to organize. If we want to change, if we want to see a different result, we have to organize. He was asking people to organize around the different issues, and together as a people, as individuals, but also collectively, demand for these justices to be changed. He believed in these ideas that could seem very logical, but in understanding that the connections that we make, the work that we do here in earth, is how we begin to build the kingdom of God. So he wanted people to understand that dignity, respect, and all these different things that were being promised had to begin here on earth. There was a common message at the time that was, if you're suffering, if your children don't have enough to eat, then this is God's will. And this is what the church, the established church, was saying at the time. Father Rutilio Grande was part of these individuals who came and said, no, this is not God's will. If your family is not eating well because your job is not being treated fairly, your position, or you're not being paid, and your children can't have access to medicine, this is not God's will. So he believed in building the kingdom of God here on earth, and he did that throughout his time as a priest in many areas, but mainly El Paisnal. And I think many people were attentive to his message and understood the importance of organizing. It came to a point where organizing was happening, and it bothered the individuals, the landowners around the area, and that's why he eventually was targeted and killed. Monsignor Romero was a good friend of Rutilio Grande, and I think it's safe to say that Rutilio Grande was the architect of this faith movement, or this design of how the church of the people should answer these different issues of injustice that the country was living through. And he was very much in Monsignor Romero's ear during the time they were friends, and would tell him, these things are happening. Monsignor Romero would be more dogmatic and respectful of the churches, probably, and of the position that he shouldn't get involved in other matters that are not church related, let's say, to a certain degree, because that's how the church at the time viewed these different issues of injustice. Like I was saying, this message of it's God's will, so let's not disturb the waters, because God's plan is allowing or has ideas that these injustices exist because it's God's plan. So Rutilio Grande was not of that idea, and would share these different thoughts with Monsignor Romero. And Monsignor Romero obviously was paying attention and listened eventually, so much so that it became part of the process that Monsignor Romero went through. Um, when Father Rutilio Grande was assassinated, that wasn't necessarily the one thing that made Monsignor Romero change. There's this kind of conception that there was this specific incident. Monsignor Romero had been going through a process, and that process, Rutilio Grande was part of that process. He was one of those individuals who shared what he was witnessing and what he was living in his community of El Paisnal and Aguilar is the bigger area of the municipality. I had I think the pleasure of meeting a Jesuit who, at the time, well, he's here again. He was had to be exiled for a time during the war, but was very close to Monsignor Romero. He was from Spain, now nationalized here, but um, Father Carranza, who actually had to give a mass in El Paisnal, but it was becoming complicated at that time. And Father Rutilio Grande told him, you shouldn't go because the National Guard is looking for excuses to expel these foreigners, and we don't want anything to happen to you. And Father Carranza shared this story with me and a group of other people, and he convinced them and said, you shouldn't go. So I'll go to El Paisnal and celebrate this mass. So as we all know, he headed to El Paisnal and gave a ride to other people, and so he was heading to El Paisnal and picked some passengers up. It's about a 20-30 minute ride from Aguilares, where the parish is, to El Paisnal. And somewhere in the middle is when they were attacked, and other individuals were able to escape. They weren't hit by the bullets, but as we know, these other two who were with him were reached by the bullets. And I think it's sad that the three of these individuals died, but it shows in a way that it shows who he was and who he was surrounded by. The community was with him at all times, and he was with the community at all times. So it's as sad and tragic as it is that three people were killed that day, when obviously the target was just Rutilio Grande. It shows that he was always surrounded by his community. Even in his death, he was surrounded by community members. I think his legacy is one that hasn't been discovered in the way that it should be, and I think it's extremely relevant today because his message was, first, one that I personally believe in and still think is more relevant than ever, which is organizing, and organizing in a way that is of inclusion. We need to include people, and to include people, it means to be willing to have conversations with other individuals. And he believed in nonviolence and how this approach should be dealt with. So there are many takeaways. I think the way that he walked with the poor, with those in the margins, is exemplary. The way that he was one of those priests that didn't wait for the parishioners to come to mass, and that wasn't the only place where he saw them. He really wanted to get to know them. He really wanted to have conversations with them. So he would go out and have these conversations in their places of work or where they lived. And I think that is a very important message for today. Sometimes we tend to wait for people to come to us, and we need to be willing to have that conversation and probably make that extra effort to meet people where they are, and figuratively and literally speaking. The other, kind of just reiterating what I said, is nonviolence. We live in times where we are being extremely disagreeable with each other, and having these conversations where we learn to disagree in a healthier way, I think, is extremely important. And through nonviolence, I think that's the key. We can't be doing anything but nonviolence in these times. Everything we talk about just escalates and continues to escalate, and very few people are actually paying attention to how this is just getting worse and worse. We talk about how it's getting worse, but we're not talking about how we can de-escalate the issues. And this is unfortunately present in many societies, not just El Salvador. So his legacy and his message is one that is not exclusive to El Salvador.